I think the ultimate takeaway is this. As an author or game designer, your passion for your work should be evident in the final product that you create. Why? Well, today I want to answer the question, what does Pathfinder 1st Edition do better than Pathfinder 2nd Edition on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a legacy storyteller who has gladly made his way to the modern era. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to what's going to be a little bit of a strange video for me as I discuss the question, what does Pathfinder 1st Edition do better than Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Now, let me just say up front that this video is a bit unscripted, as honestly, I'm still working through my thoughts on this subject. Recently, I have seen a lot of conversations surrounding this question, what does Pathfinder 1e do better than Pathfinder 2e? And even though I have seen these questions many times since Pathfinder 2e initially launched, recently I have begun to see this question in a new and interesting light. Honestly, I feel like the upcoming Pathfinder 2e remaster has helped me to look back at Pathfinder 1st Edition and consider some of its strengths that maybe I just couldn't properly highlight before. Now, as a storyteller who strongly prefers Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I can say plainly that Pathfinder 2e is definitely my preferred game, but at the same time, I still have a ton of fantastic memories from my time playing Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I even still play a few hours of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous on my computer just to relax every week, so obviously Pathfinder 1e still has a lot of appeal to me, and for a long time I don't know if I could have expressed that appeal, but I think I finally have reached a point where I can begin to express what Pathfinder 1e meant to me, what some of the strengths of that system were, and what game designers or the gaming community can learn from Pathfinder 1st Edition that could benefit future products going forward. Now, this video is a bit of a departure from my normal content on this channel, so I would definitely love to know what you think about this topic, and I really want you to participate in the conversation. Yes, there's a lot of stuff you can do here on YouTube to help support the channel. Like, share, subscribe, check out Discord, check out Patreon. Those links are in the video description. YouTube stuff done. But really and truthfully, the main thing I would love to do is hear your thoughts on this question. So today, I'm going to share what I think is one of the greatest strengths of Pathfinder 1e, but I would love to hear your thoughts as well. So jump down to the comment section and let me know what you think Pathfinder 1e did that Pathfinder 2e could learn a few lessons from. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so let me give you the rough pitch of this video just to start the conversation. I think that Pathfinder 1e can be categorized as a legacy game, and Pathfinder 2e can be categorized as a modern game, but I think the critical difference between these two, and the important lesson worth noting here, is that Pathfinder 1e in many ways feels like a celebration of legacy gaming, whereas Pathfinder 2e feels like an excellently made modern game, but not necessarily a celebration of modern gaming. And I think it's that missing element of celebration that, at least in a few areas, gives Pathfinder 1e an edge over Pathfinder 2e. Now, really quick, let me give you some caveats before we go any farther in this conversation. Caveat number one, I'm not sure about the terminology that I'm using here. Calling Pathfinder 1e a legacy game, calling Pathfinder 2e a modern game, I'm not sure if this is the best description. These are the best words I've been able to come up with so far, but I know some people that I've talked to about this have disagreed with my terminology. So if you think there is better terminology that could describe and differentiate on these issues, by all means I would love to hear it, because this is very much a conversation where I feel like I'm just really beginning to explore the issue, and I certainly feel like there's a lot that I have to learn. Also, another thing worth noting is, and if you're a fan of this channel you probably already know this, Pathfinder 2e is hands down my favorite TTRPG. I've played a lot of TTRPGs, I love a lot of TTRPGs, this is a hobby that I am passionate about, but it should be no surprise to anyone watching that if I had to pick a favorite, Pathfinder 2e wins, and wins by a pretty comfortable margin. I'm not trying to dig at Pathfinder 1st Edition or Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I'm not trying to insult either game. I love them both. I may prefer Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I still feel like there are things that Pathfinder 2e can learn from the previous edition of the game, and that's the focus of this conversation. One last set of caveats. I'm going to be using a couple of comparisons or analogies in this video, and again, this is kind of an area where I'm struggling with terminology, so these are the best comparisons that I can come up with, but I am totally open to other comparisons that you may have that could further this conversation. In this video, I'm going to be comparing Pathfinder 1st Edition and Pathfinder 2nd Edition to Dungeons & Dragons. And I think the reason for that comparison should be pretty obvious. They occupy similar spaces, they serve similar functions in the TTRPG sphere, and more importantly, Pathfinder 1st Edition inherited much of its legacy and content from D&D 3.5, so I think D&D as a comparison is just kind of a natural fit for the conversation. The other thing I'm going to be talking a little bit is the idea of classic cars versus modern cars, and you'll see why when I bring that into the conversation later. But part of the reason that I've chosen to use that as an allegory in this video is I'm not a classic car person. That particular bug has never bitten me, it's not really one of my interests, and I am perfectly happy driving around my Hyundai Sonata Hybrid. But I will say, my dad is a classic car person. He loves to build and repair old cars, and he loves to go to classic car shows, so I've been around the classic car world, and even if it's not my particular thing, I can understand the appeal of classic cars to the people that are in that particular community, and in a similar way, I think I understand the appeal that Pathfinder 1st Edition has for so many in the gaming community, even if I myself have moved on to a more modern game. And I'm sure you can see from the caveats I've put out already that the large comparison I'm going to be making is comparing Pathfinder 1st Edition in many ways to what you might consider a classic car to be, versus Pathfinder 2nd Edition being more in line with a modern car. Part of the reason I think this is a good allegory is while Pathfinder 1st Edition and 2nd Edition on the outside serve a very similar purpose and have a very similar function, the internal aspects of the game are quite different. Much like lifting the hood on a classic car and a modern car, you are going to be dealing with two very different machines, and if you choose to drive one machine over the other, you will find that you have a very different experience, even if they are both serving the same general function for you. I may prefer the modern ride, but I will admit that there is some appeal and quite a bit of fun to be had with the legacy model as well. Now, what really got me thinking in these terms about Pathfinder 1e and 2e is the recent news surrounding the Pathfinder 2e remaster. Now, I already have a video on this channel where I reacted to some of the news surrounding the Pathfinder 2e remaster, and I'll throw a link up here in case you want to go check that out. I have said openly that I am pretty optimistic about the Pathfinder 2e remaster, and I think that it's going to be a very good thing for the state of the game. But that being said, I've also shared that there are some aspects of the Pathfinder 2e remaster where I do have some hang-ups, and in large part, my hang-ups with the remaster revolve around some of the legacy elements of the game that are going to be going away when the remaster happens. Now, allow me to say clearly for the second time on this channel, I understand the business reasons why Paizo is doing what they're doing with some of the legacy elements of the game. It makes sense what Paizo is doing, and I think they are making a smart move. But at the same time, it still hurts to lose legacy elements of the game, especially when I feel like the only reason those legacy elements are going away is because of some of the shady stuff that Wizards of the Coast has been doing. Still, this conversation around the Pathfinder 2e remaster has gotten me thinking about the history of Pathfinder, and I want to talk about that history for a moment to help explain why I chose the legacy versus modern concept to describe the difference between first edition and second edition. So let's go back to D&D 3.5, the game that began to drain way too much money out of my pocket. I played D&D 3.0 and 3.5 for quite some time, absolutely love the game, and I still have a massive collection of D&D 3.5 books that I still occasionally read for fun. It was just a really wonderful variation of the game, and something that I fondly remember. Well, I was around when Wizards of the Coast made the decision to move from D&D 3.5 to D&D 4th edition. And while opinions about D&D 4th edition can run all over the place, let us just say that D&D 4th edition was a controversial choice in many ways, and personally for me, one of the things that made me really reluctant about engaging with D&D 4e was the fact that Wizards of the Coast, when they marketed this new edition of the game, they spent a lot of time just really trashing the previous edition. There were a series of commercials that Wizards of the Coast released where basically all they did was insult D&D 3.5 and by extension the people who played D&D 3.5 as people who were using this terrible game. I'm pretty sure the moment Wizards of the Coast lost me as a customer was in one of their advertisements for 4th edition. There were a group of people who were playing D&D 3.5 and they couldn't figure out how grapple worked. And you had 4 people sitting around a table visibly flipping back and forth, panicking because they didn't know how to do grapple in D&D 3.5, and it was just impossible to figure out. And the first time I watched that commercial, I saw them flip past the page with the grapple rules. I'm not joking, the commercial was that bad. But I just remember watching that commercial and feeling like Wizards of the Coast was insulting their old game and insulting anybody who played their old game, and it left such a bad taste in my mouth that I really had no desire to move to Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, and that leads straight into the reason that I became a fan of Paizo, where Dungeons & Dragons was shaming the legacy of their game. Paizo embraced it. So much of the success of Pathfinder 1st edition really boils down to the fact that Paizo was willing to embrace the legacy of Dungeons & Dragons 3.0 and 3.5, and some of the legacy that even went beyond those two versions of the game. Where Wizards of the Coast was just trying to push forward and do this brand new pretty thing, Paizo was willing to look at the history of the game and say, hey, this history is a good thing. And when you play Pathfinder 1st edition, in so many ways it feels like a celebration of old school gaming. I could dig into a lot of different examples here, but honestly this is a conversation that could go on way too long. For a simple example, Paizo actually threw Thessalonian Rune Lords into their setting and used them to justify including a style of old school AD&D specialist wizard mechanics in Pathfinder 1st edition. It was like the authors and designers at Paizo looked at the history that Wizards of the Coast was throwing in the trash and said, hey, this is a fantastic thing, and there's no reason to treat it with such disrespect. Now, you could dig into a lot of different points here about the competition between D&D 4e and Pathfinder 1e. If nothing else, the fact that Pathfinder 1e built so heavily upon D&D 3.5 that it was easy for people who had played the old system to move over, that was probably a large part of Pathfinder's success. Overall, I think it's clear and easy to say that Wizards of the Coast shunned their legacy while Paizo was willing to embrace and even celebrate that legacy, resulting in what was a fantastic gaming experience in Pathfinder 1st Edition. Fast forward the clock though, and gaming took another step forward. First you have Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, where I think that Wizards of the Coast took a second and probably better shot at trying to develop a modern TTRPG. One of the things that Wizards of the Coast did is they heavily trimmed down the rules of D&D with the hope of making it a more narrative game with a better focus on action and storytelling over a myriad of arcane and mechanical rules that people had to memorize. Now, I want to be very clear here. I think Wizards of the Coast was trying to make a modern game with Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, and I think they were clearly trying to have a more narrative focus in the style of game they produced. It is an entirely separate question whether or not they succeeded in that endeavor, but I'm not going to chase that particular rabbit today. For now, I'd just like to focus on the fact that when Wizards of the Coast went to D&D 5e, they were willing to open the game up, and they were willing to ask some very impressive questions. Do we need this? And they were willing to tear chunks of the game out. They were willing to rearrange chunks of the game. They were willing to do some serious surgery on the entire product to produce what they hoped would be a far better and more modern game. And honestly, I think that you can look at Pathfinder 2e as a very similar concept. Paizo, when it came time to do Pathfinder 2nd Edition, they also were willing to do some pretty heavy surgery on the core mechanics of the Pathfinder game. You'll hear this illustration from Paizo game designers. They were willing to open the patient up and do some really serious surgery and ask some really important questions about what was necessary, what wasn't, and what could be rearranged in order to produce a better, more modern game. Now, I do think there's a distinction we can't chase too far here, in that Paizo was willing to embrace mechanical complexity, where D&D shunned mechanical complexity, and that's its own tangent. I do think Paizo made the right choice there, but the similarity between the two systems can be seen in the fact that Wizards of the Coast and Paizo were both willing to do very major alterations to their core game in order to update it and help it to function better. This is part of the reason I say Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a modern game, because it's a game where Paizo was willing to look at a legacy element and say, if we don't need it, it's gone. And so that brings us to my initial comparison, where I look at Pathfinder 1st Edition as largely a legacy game that is in many ways a celebration of the legacy of the game. Whereas Pathfinder 2e is more a modern game where the designers were really willing to go in and do the work under the hood, if you will, to ask the question, what do we need, what can we throw away, and how can we redesign this product so that it works better? Now, a couple of quick notes here. First, let me say, Pathfinder 1e did have innovations, it did have improvements. While it was in many ways a celebration of legacy gaming, I think that Paizo was still very much a creative company at the time, and they were more than willing to find ways to improve upon the formula they had, and a good example of that was the introduction of archetypes. I'm not saying that Pathfinder 1e was legacy only, there were modern elements, and with Pathfinder 2e, I'm not saying it's a modern-only game. Clearly it has some legacy elements in it, as evidenced by some of the things that Paizo is going to have to remove as part of the remaster process. It's not like either game is 100% one thing or the other. But it does feel like there's a philosophical difference between them. Essentially, with Pathfinder 1st Edition, you have a game that feels, that's the important word, feels like a celebration of classic gaming. It's like going to a classic car show with my dad. I may not be a particular fan of classic cars, but when I look around the lot and see all of these old cars have been refurbished and that people have poured time and money and energy and effort into rebuilding, you can't help but get caught up in the passion of the people that love classic cars. Pathfinder 1st Edition clearly had a love for classic gaming. Obviously the core of that was D&D 3.5, but like I said, you can dig a little deeper and see some other ways that that is true if you're really willing to go deep on Pathfinder 1e. Pathfinder 1e just feels like a game that loves where it came from, and that passion for its own history comes through in how the game plays and feels at the gaming table. By the way, another tangent I'm not necessarily going to chase today, but is also applicable here. Starfinder is a game that also feels like a passion project. The authors at Paizo really feel like they love Starfinder and love what they're doing with the game, and it really comes through with how they write. Whereas Pathfinder 2nd Edition ends up feeling reserved. Now, don't get me wrong, I think part of that is the developmental philosophy behind the game. Paizo was willing to open up the patient and really ask, what do we need? What can we toss? What needs to be replaced for the health and good of the game? There's an old piece of advice that's given to writers all the time where they say, kill your darlings, which is basically a way of telling writers, just because you like it, it doesn't mean it's good for the story. And Paizo was very clearly willing in Pathfinder 2nd Edition to hold up every piece of the puzzle and ask, do we need this? Or do we need to make the hard decision to cut this? They were asking far more diagnostic, far more critical thinking oriented questions, and as a result, you end up with a product that functions extremely well, but also feels kind of reserved because it feels like the authors and designers in Pathfinder 2e are not willing to take the same chances that they were with Pathfinder 1st Edition or, like I mentioned, Starfinder. Now, I want to be clear, I do think the authors and designers at Paizo clearly are passionate about Pathfinder 2e. It's just the philosophy of how they're developing the game naturally requires them to rein some of that passion in to make sure that what they're designing fits with their intended goals. And honestly, this is a tangent I could chase in a lot of circles, so I'm not going to go too far today, but there is this natural tension between doing something because you're passionate about it and doing something for the technical mastery of it. They are not always in opposition, but many times they do end up as opposing forces, and balancing the tension between them is difficult. First Edition feels like a game that pulled more towards the passion side of the equation, where Pathfinder 2nd Edition feels like a game that pulled more towards the technical mastery side, and honestly, you can't fault the designers in either case. So what does this mean going forward? Well, first off, with the Pathfinder 2e remaster coming up, I think that this presents a very important opportunity for Pathfinder 2nd Edition for Paizo to show their passion in their work. Again, I think there is plenty of passion there already, but I really want to see Paizo be willing to let their passion drive their design more than they have thus far in the history of 2nd Edition. I think that there are a lot of great ideas that they may have been afraid to run with thus far in the history of the game because maybe the design process itself was holding them back. In Pathfinder 1st Edition and later in Starfinder, Paizo showed themselves to be very willing to try new things and to really celebrate the game they had, and I really love what Pathfinder 2e does, so I would really love to see Paizo have that same sense of celebration for this new edition of the game. But outside of Pathfinder, I think one of the conversations that's worth having for any game designer is passion is a critical element in writing and game design, and to any writers, any game designers, anyone in the TTRPG sphere out there, I would just encourage you, don't let the technicals cause you to forget the heart, the passion behind what you are actually doing. I think a lot of people still absolutely love Pathfinder 1st Edition and maybe a lot of other old games because the passion of the authors of those games is so evident, and even while we strive for better modern games, I do think it's still instructive that our passion as game designers now remain just as evident and just as clear. The truth is, when the artist is passionate, the people observing the art are likely to get swept up in that passion as well. But what do you think? The time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. I've been focusing on philosophical differences between Pathfinder 1e and 2e, and what I think is a celebratory philosophy that Pathfinder 1e possessed. Do you agree with that assessment? Jump down to the comments section and let me know what you think. while you're down there, if there are other aspects of Pathfinder 1E that you think were truly superlative, that are worth examining and discussing, feel free to share those as well. Examining the successes of the past can only give us more information to make better games in the future. Of course, don't forget to do all of that other YouTube stuff. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord or my Patreon. Links in the video description. But, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.